Here's another great example the student did of the panning technique. So as the runner was running across the frame of the camera, he followed the runner and at some point hit the shutter as he continued to follow. So they're pretty much in focus, and then the background is out of focus, and that creates that blur. A very, very common one is water. And you'll see these photos all the time, and this has to do with shutter speed. So the photographer had their camera on a tripod or a very, very steady surface and has a slow shutter speed. So because it's on a steady surface, all this is completely sharp and in focus, and then it creates that motion blur. So that's how that's accomplished. Same thing with all these water images. So for this assignment, if you do a water image, just do one to try to get a good one, but that's how this is accomplished. Slow shutter speed. And of course, Google search all these sorts of images. Here's a slow shutter speed. This one's pretty cool. So they had their camera on a tripod or on the cooler or the beach towel or something, set their timer up for this one's probably about half a second, maybe a second. So of course, all this is in focus. They're in focus because they did not move during this entire time, and these people happen to be walking through, so they get that motion blur. And I think this is a million times better image because of this motion here versus just these women standing in the background. Okay, so we'll look through some other images. Okay, so shutter speeds, you're going to see them written out like this: 1/2, quarter, eighth, 15/30, and a 60th. And 60th is a good marker as far as it's the slowest you should go without a tripod. If you hold your shutter halfway down on your point and shoot camera, and there should be some numbers along the bottom that we're beginning to recognize, the f-stop, the ISO, and the shutter speed, and the shutter speed is lower than 160, it looks like one of these numbers, and there's all sorts of numbers in between, but it's slower than that. You should have a tripod rested against a desk, rested against some sort of object to give you a little bit more stability. Okay, about 125th will stop people walking, 250 running and jumping, and then you can get faster and faster and faster. And those are those sorts of numbers. And like I said, there's all sorts of numbers in between there, but those are kind of the main ones that older cameras were set up with. Okay, so why slow shutter? Of course, movement, like we've talked about. You're going to get more light into your camera. So you can get an exposure that looks like daylight in the evening with very little light because you have a long exposure. There's lots of times where it's like a night sky and you see stars moving and it looks like it's almost daytime. That's what happens when you have a slow shutter speed. This one's interesting. What this person did, somebody was driving down the road. They put their camera on a slower shutter speed, rested it on the side of the car so it had that stable part of the car, put the camera on their timer for 10-second timer, it counted down, opened the shutter up for a second or however long this was, closed it, and you get all these motion blurs here with these lights. The same thing, I'm sure you've seen photos of interstates with all the red lights going. Those are the brake lights from the car, and you can get those with a slow shutter speed. This one, same thing, people walking, you get that motion in the image, which I think adds interest to it. Here as well. These people happen to not be moving, so they're sharp and in focus, and these people were moving, so they're blurry. Here as well, shows motion. I don't think this image would have been nearly as good had they just been frozen in their action, showing a lot of this fencing. Here we go with the brake lights. Something on point-and-shoot cameras to be able to force a slow shutter speed to your camera, you might have a firework setting, a candle setting, or a low light setting on there. If you use one of those, it should automatically force your camera to have a longer shutter speed. Same thing here, panning. This, easy to get. It was just 4th of July. Fireworks are probably half price right now. Set your camera on a table. Put the timer on as soon as the shutter opens, or just start going around with sparklers, fireworks, a flashlight. You can paint your name, anything you can think of. And also with panning, like we look at this, they're going left to right, and all the ones we've been looking at are going left to right. You could think of going vertical as well. If you and a friend were to jump off a chair at the same time and keep the person's face in the same part of the screen on your camera, as they go down, it'll be a vertical panning. So this one's left to right, so it'll be a vertical one instead. Okay, so here is a slow shutter speed camera on a tripod, and this is, in this area, is the North Star. Of course, it's stationary, and all these other stars, or I guess the Earth is moving, not the stars, but they create this blur. So the star started here and moved all the way to there while the shutter was open. Same thing here. That's a North Star. It's stationary. We have this area here in the foreground, which is not moving, but the Earth is moving around these stars, or the Earth is rotating. Another panning technique. Okay, so now we have stop motion. So this is a fast shutter speed. So if you could pick between these two, which one would you pick? I actually like this one better. It's a lot more artistic, but as far as Sports Illustrated or cover of a newspaper would go, they would probably pick that one. But it's all personal preference. Okay, so fast shutter. You can freeze the action. You also have to use a fast shutter when there's tons of light. So if you're trying to capture that water motion blur when the sun is hitting it, you're not going to be able to accomplish it. It needs to be overcast, shaded, or late in the day when there's not much light to get that slower shutter. So here we go. Fast shutter, freeze all that action. Same thing here. So it is entirely an artistic decision on what you want to do with your image. This exercise is simply for you to know how to control the shutter on your camera, so if there's ever an instance where you think, man, blurring that motion would be really nice for this, you know how to do it. Or if you want to stop an action, you can do it as well. Okay, so metering on your camera. This might get a little technical, but everybody's camera should have this somewhere on it. And what you might have to do, this is SLR camera, but if you push the shutter halfway down on your point and shoot, that should come up, which that's your shutter speed, that's your f-stop. Of course, we have our battery icon. You're going to have your ISO, you're going to have the amount of frames left, what your white balance is set to, and all sorts of other things. So that's what a Nikon camera is going to look like. Okay, now on your camera, this is a Canon, so the metering, it's completely opposite. On a Nikon, if you want to go overexposed, you go left to go to the plus. Canon, if you want to go overexposed, you go right to go to the plus. If you have any questions about this in your specific camera, please let me know. The main thing is on these, okay, so here's a Nikon again. That's the Canon. Okay, point and shoot cameras. You're going to have a little plus minus button somewhere on your camera. It's normally on the back somewhere, and if you push that button, whoops. Okay, so if you push that button, something like this should come up. And this little white line, or this little line, should be right in the center. And then you can tell the camera to go this way, or you can go to the left, depending on your camera. So that means you can tell it if you want the image to be overexposed or underexposed. So that's a way to cheat and tell your camera if you want your shutter speed to be faster or slower. So this is another thing to experiment with as far as shutter speeds go.